We now begin our 8th and final video on the historical and narrative arc of the Old Testament. I've been intentional to not get into too many details. Our purpose with these videos is to provide a big picture perspective on the Old Testament. In this video, we'll bring together the final two periods of Old Testament history, the exile and the restoration from exile, when the Jewish people returned to the land of Judah. And the first thing to note on this is that the exile was not a single event. There are actually 6 separate exiles that are commonly referenced in the Old Testament. And the term exile refers to the forced deportation of a people from their homeland. Typically included the deportation of the king, or at least members of the royal family or ruling class. This was not just prisoners of war. And it was practiced by many conquering nations and empires in the ancient Near East, as we've already seen a little bit. The first exile was the one that occurred in the year 722, and that involved the northern kingdom of Israel. And we briefly discussed this in this exile in the video on the divided monarchy. Assyria, was the nation that conquered Israel. They destroyed the capital of Samaria, and they deported the Israelites, and again, specifically talking about the northern kingdom. And if you recall, the policy of the Assyrians was to deport conquered people and then have the land resettled by other nations whom they had conquered elsewhere. The next exile was relatively quite small. After Josiah was killed by the Egyptians, Jehoahaz was crowned king. Now, Egypt, when they killed Josiah, they effectively gained control of Judah. And so after only 3 months of rule, Jehoahaz was taken captive to Egypt. And again, this was quite small-scale exile. Egypt only had control of Judah for a few years. In 605, Babylon defeated them, and they thus gained control of the Levant. And it was at this time that Babylon deported a number of officials and members of the royal family to Babylon. And while this exile was, again, also very small in scale, it did include a prominent youth named Daniel. Now, I want to note that the prophet Jeremiah was quite active during these final days of the nation of Judah. Jeremiah repeatedly told the people of Judah that Babylon was actually an instrument in God's hands. The Babylonians were sent by God to punish the nation for its sin, and so the people of Judah should willingly submit to the Babylonians. Now, of course, the people didn't. Instead, they listened to false prophets who promised deliverance, and they continued for this reason in their rebellions against the Babylonians, and that resulted in these multiple exile events. And in 598, we see one of the biggest of those exiles. This was much larger in scale than those we just saw in 605 and 609 before that. King Jehoiakim was deported. Again, he had only reigned for just 3 months, along with many thousands of residents of Judah. This was a devastating moment in the nation's history. And then we get to 586. After even more further rebellions in Judah, and there was a lengthy siege of Jerusalem, the Babylonians finally destroyed the city and the temple. All the remaining citizens, except for the very poorest, were then deported to Babylon. And it is hard to overstate the significance of this event. It's probably the single most defining moment in Judah's history. Now, I want to summarize the crisis around their understanding of 3 things, and those 3 things are land, king, and temple. So first of all, the land that Judah occupied was their inheritance through Abraham. The land of Canaan, in their view, was their birthright. And second, the king. The king who ruled from Jerusalem was part of the lineage of David, and God had promised that the throne of David would endure forever. And then the temple. That was the place where God had caused his name to dwell, symbolizing that God himself dwelled in their midst. As he was the maker of heaven and earth, they believed that he would never allow for his dwelling to be destroyed by a foreign army invading. Each of these three things, land, king, and temple, were ripped from them by the Babylonians. And in doing so, that would have a profound effect on their own sense of identity as a people, as a nation. But we continue on, even after the destruction of Jerusalem, when only the poorest of the people remained in the land. We still had issues. Babylon had installed a governor, but there continued to be these small rebellious groups that caused trouble in Judah, and that led to another relatively small deportation in 581 to Babylon. This probably feels like it's a lot to keep track of. The two dates that you really need to remember above all, these are the most significant in the history of Israel and Judah. 722 was the destruction and deportation of the northern kingdom of Israel by Assyria. After 722, you don't have a northern kingdom anymore. 586 was the destruction of Jerusalem and the temple and the deportation of all the citizens to Babylon. These other exile events were also very important, but these were the most significant ones to remember. I've already mentioned the devastating psychological effects the events of 586 would have had on the nation of Judah. And those events are described in a number of texts of the Old Testament, but perhaps nowhere is it described with as much emotion as in the book of Lamentations. The author grieves over the destruction of Jerusalem, trying to grapple with all that the nation has lost, all that the nation has suffered. How lonely sits the city that was full of people. How like a widow she has become. She who was great among the nations, she who was a princess among the provinces, has become a slave. As Judah struggled to come to grips with the reality of the exile, we also want to take a moment to consider the events that were transpiring in Babylon. Babylon was an ancient city, even from the perspective of the kingdom of Judah. The Babylonian nation that we're describing is actually known as the Neo-Babylonian or the New Babylonian Empire. It was founded by Nabopolassar in 626 BCE. If you recall, this was the time when Babylon, 626, they gained independence from the Assyrians. Assyria had been ruling over all of the ancient Near East, and Babylon, 626, they gained independence, eventually conquering Nineveh and replacing the Assyrians as the dominant superpower. Following Nabopolassar, we get the Neo-Babylonians' most famous ruler, we know from the Bible, Nebuchadnezzar II. He was the ruler who was responsible for all four of the Babylonian exiles that we just discussed. He led many impressive building projects and renovations, such as the renovations to the famous Ishtar Gate that you see in this slide. He also features very prominently in the book of Daniel as the young Judean has multiple interactions with the king Nebuchadnezzar. Now, I'm not discussing every ruler of the Neo-Babylonians, but we will discuss the final king as it helps us to understand how their empire ended and how things transitioned. Nabonidus became king of the Neo-Babylonian Empire in 556. Most nations in the ancient Near East worshipped a multitude of different gods, but they generally always had one god that they worshipped above all the others. And for Babylon, the god Marduk was worshipped as their national god, who they considered to be above all others. Nabonidus seemed to take special interest in elevating the worship of the moon god, who was called Sin. Now, some people, such as priests and other members of the nobility, felt that Nabonidus was actually neglecting his duty as king to ensure that Marduk was being properly worshipped as the chief or the national god. Nabonidus also, he left the city of Babylon for extended periods of time so he could focus on these building projects and monuments and temples in honor of Sin, the moon god. One notable example of that was that he oversaw the restoration of the great ziggurat of Ur from the time of the Sumerians that was dedicated to the moon god. Now, for these reasons, many scholars believe that the fall of Babylon to the Persians was largely due to these internal conflicts that were happening within Babylon, as the priests and nobility were opposed to these actions being taken by Nabonidus. The person who is credited with the fall of the Neo-Babylonian Empire was known as Cyrus the Great. When he took control of Babylon, many think he was actually welcomed by many of the Babylonians. He announced that the god Marduk, the chief god of the Babylonians, he said that Marduk had sent him and that he wanted to restore the worship of Marduk as the national god of Babylon. Cyrus wore a number of titles, including King of Persia, King of Babylon, but perhaps the most significant was the title that he took as the ruler of the Achaemenid Empire, King of Kings. When he conquered Babylon, taking the title as King of Babylon, he issued what is known as the Edict of Cyrus. A version of this is found in the Bible, in the book of Ezra, but it's also found in some artifacts, such as this clay cylinder pictured here, which can be found in the British Museum. The Persians wanted to restore all of the temples and the nations that they conquered. See, their policy was different, and this is what the edict was allowing people to return home, because they wanted their conquered nations, their policy was to ensure that all of the various gods of those nations were being properly worshipped. They felt like if all the gods are happy, they will have greater control and greater stability in their empire. So shortly after the Edict of Cyrus, beginning in 538, we have the first wave of people returning to Judah from the exile in Babylon. Among those included in this first return was Zerubbabel, who was descended from the lineage of David, and he was made a governor in Judah. And when they returned, the people immediately rebuilt the altar of the temple so that they could again perform sacrifices. They did, however, face opposition from their neighbors. The construction of the temple was delayed, but it was eventually completed and rededicated in the year 516, which was 70 years after it had been destroyed by Babylon. And the map you see here is the extent of the Persian Empire at around 500 BCE, when it was at its largest. The second wave of people returning occurred in 458, and this was much smaller. The scribe Ezra was included among those returning. Now, Ezra was a very significant figure at this stage of Judah's history. He instituted many religious reforms, helping to establish faithfulness to God's covenant among the people of Judah. But this was the second wave, and it was not from Babylon, but it was from the Persian city Susa as people were returning to Jerusalem. The final wave then occurred in 444 BCE. This time it included Nehemiah, who was instrumental in helping to rebuild the walls of Jerusalem. Again, Judah was facing a lot of opposition from its neighbors, and there are very significant stories and events that happen from around this time, such as the story of Esther, which takes place in the city of Susa. The nation of Judah had radically transformed over the centuries. Many things had changed, but at the core, the people believed that God somehow was going to conquer their enemies and that he would bring blessing to the nations through Israel. This hope was often expressed by the prophets as the day of the Lord. This was when God would accomplish his victory and fulfill his promise to Abraham. The prophet Malachi was active during this time after the exile, and he concludes his book by pointing toward this hope. Around the year 450, he announces that God is going to send the prophet Elijah before the coming of the day of the Lord. So the Old Testament essentially concludes not with a great resolution, but with an expectation and a hope that God was not through with the Israelites. The prophet Elijah would come, and then the day of the Lord.